Jimin secretly buys Jungkook's dream house, but the heartbreaking reason hidden behind the gift changes both of their lives forever. The sharp crack of thunder swallowed every other sound as Jungkook stood frozen beneath the shelter of an old oak tree, rainwater sliding from his dark hair onto trembling shoulders. Across the valley, the small white cottage he had dreamed about since childhood glowed softly beneath the gray sky, its warm lights flickering behind lace curtains exactly as he remembered. Every stone in the garden path, every flower bed surrounding the porch, every weathered wooden fence carried memories that had refused to fade despite the passing years. He had believed the house had been sold months ago to an unknown buyer. That belief had become another silent wound he carried without complaint. Yet today, the front gate slowly opened by itself. Jimin stepped outside holding a large black umbrella, his shoes sinking into the soaked earth as he walked toward Jungkook with unusually hesitant steps. His calm smile failed to hide the exhaustion beneath his eyes. "I knew you'd come eventually," Jimin said softly, his voice almost disappearing beneath the rain. Jungkook stared at him without moving. "Why are you here?" he whispered. Jimin looked toward the cottage before answering. "Because this house has been waiting for its real owner." Jungkook frowned, unable to understand the meaning behind those words. "The owner already bought it." Jimin lowered his gaze for several seconds before quietly replying, "Yes, I did." The world seemed to stop. Even the rain felt strangely distant. Jungkook blinked several times as if expecting the sentence to disappear. "What?" he asked, almost breathless. "I bought the house." Jimin reached into his coat pocket and carefully unfolded several documents protected inside a waterproof folder. They bore official seals, signatures, and ownership certificates. Jungkook stared at the papers but could barely read the words. His heartbeat drowned every thought inside his mind. "You bought my dream house?" Jimin nodded once. "Months ago." Confusion slowly transformed into disbelief. "Why would you do something like that?" Jungkook demanded, taking a step backward. "Do you think I need your pity?" Jimin immediately shook his head. "No." "Then why?" Silence stretched between them. Rain continued falling against the umbrella like thousands of tiny footsteps. Jimin's fingers tightened around the documents before he answered. "Because I overheard your conversation years ago." Jungkook looked puzzled. Jimin smiled sadly. "You probably don't remember. We were 17. You stood outside your grandmother's hospital room. You thought nobody could hear you." Jungkook's expression slowly changed. Fragments of forgotten memories returned. A frightened teenager staring through hospital windows. Sleepless nights, hospital corridors filled with the scent of antiseptic, his grandmother smiling despite her illness. Jimin continued speaking quietly. "You promised her that one day you'd buy back this cottage because it was the last place where your family had truly been happy." Jungkook's breathing became uneven. He remembered saying those words through tears, believing no one had been nearby. "You heard that?" Jimin nodded gently, every word. The silence that followed carried years of hidden emotions neither of them had ever discussed. Jimin walked toward the old mailbox standing beside the gate. Its faded blue paint had begun peeling away with age. He opened it and carefully removed a small envelope wrapped in plastic to protect it from the rain. "I found this after purchasing the property," he said. It had fallen behind the mailbox. Jungkook accepted it with trembling hands. The handwriting on the envelope immediately stole his breath. It belonged to his grandmother. His fingers shook violently before opening it. Inside rested a single folded letter, yellowed by time but perfectly preserved. The familiar scent of dried lavender escaped as soon as he unfolded the paper. Tears blurred his vision before he could finish the first sentence. "My dear Jungkook, if you're reading this, then someone kind has finally brought you home. Never measure love by money. Measure it by the people who quietly carry your dreams when you become too tired to carry them yourself." Jungkook could no longer hold back his tears. His shoulders trembled uncontrollably as years of buried grief surfaced all at once. He lowered himself onto the damp wooden steps of the porch, unable to speak. Jimin remained beside him without saying anything, allowing the silence to comfort more deeply than words ever could. The rain gradually softened into a gentle drizzle. Clouds slowly parted above the valley, allowing pale golden sunlight to spill across the cottage roof. Tiny droplets sparkled like scattered diamonds upon the garden flowers. For the first time in many years, the lonely house no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. Jungkook wiped his eyes before finally finding enough strength to ask the question still lingering inside his heart. "How much did you sacrifice to buy this place?" Jimin smiled faintly without looking at him. "Enough." "That's not an answer." Jimin laughed quietly. "I sold almost everything I owned that wasn't truly important." Jungkook turned toward him in complete disbelief. "You did what?" "The expensive apartment. You sold it." "Yes." "Your sports car, gone." "Your investment portfolio." Jimin shrugged with a gentle smile. "Most of it." Jungkook stared at him as though seeing him for the very first time. "You're unbelievable." Jimin looked toward the glowing windows of the cottage. "No," he whispered. "This house is. It gave someone hope once. I simply wanted it to do that again." The warm breeze carried the scent of wet grass, blooming roses, and freshly washed earth through the quiet valley. Somewhere in the distance, birds cautiously began singing after the storm had passed. Jungkook looked around the property with tears still resting in his eyes. Every corner held memories that had once hurt too much to revisit. Now those same memories somehow felt lighter. The pain had not disappeared, but it had finally found a place where it could peacefully rest. He folded his grandmother's letter with great care before placing it safely inside his jacket. Then, without another word, he stepped forward and embraced Jimin tightly. It was not an embrace born from obligation or gratitude alone. It was the embrace of someone who had finally realized that the greatest gifts were never the ones bought with money, but the ones protected by years of silent devotion, unwavering patience, and a love that had quietly guarded another person's dream until the day it could finally become reality. The embrace lingered longer than either of them expected, not because they were searching for words, but because both finally understood that some emotions had waited years for silence to translate them. The rain had completely stopped, leaving thousands of shimmering droplets clinging to the leaves surrounding the cottage. A cool breeze drifted through the valley, carrying the scent of pine trees, damp earth, and blooming jasmine. Jungkook slowly stepped back, his eyes still glistening. He looked at Jimin as though trying to memorize every expression on his face. "You should have told me," he said quietly. Jimin smiled with gentle resignation. "If I had told you, you would have stopped me." Jungkook lowered his head. He knew that was true. Pride had always been his greatest shield and at times his greatest weakness. Accepting kindness had never come naturally to him. Ever since losing his parents at a young age and later watching his grandmother fight a long illness, he had convinced himself that surviving meant carrying every burden alone. Depending on someone else felt dangerous, as though happiness could disappear the moment he reached for it. Jimin had understood that fear long before Jungkook himself did. "Come inside," Jimin said softly. "There's something else I want you to see." Jungkook followed him through the old wooden doorway. The familiar creak echoed through the hallway exactly as it had years before. Nothing inside resembled an expensive renovation. Instead, everything had been restored with extraordinary care. The original oak floors had been polished rather than replaced. The stone fireplace still stood proudly in the living room, its warm flames dancing gently behind the iron grate. The old bookshelf remained against the wall, filled with classics that Jungkook remembered reading as a child while his grandmother knitted beside the fire. Even the faded floral curtains had been recreated from old family photographs. Jungkook slowly ran his fingertips across the dining table. Tiny scratches marked its surface, each one carrying invisible stories from another lifetime. "This table," he whispered. "I learned to draw here." Jimin nodded. "I found the carpenter who built it 40 years ago. His grandson repaired it instead of making a new one." Jungkook looked at him in astonishment. "You searched for the carpenter? It took almost 3 months." Jimin laughed quietly. He was living in another town. Every answer only deepened Jungkook's disbelief. He continued walking through the house until he reached the small kitchen. Copper pans hung neatly above the stove. Fresh bread rested beneath a linen cloth. The aroma of homemade soup filled the room with comforting warmth. For a brief moment, he almost expected his grandmother to turn around from the stove with her familiar smile. Instead, Jimin carefully lifted the lid from the simmering pot. "I used her recipe," he admitted shyly. Jungkook stared at him. "You know her recipe?" Jimin rubbed the back of his neck. "Not exactly. I spent weeks asking neighbors who remembered how she cooked. Mrs. Han from across the valley helped me recreate it." Jungkook could not help smiling through his tears. "You really did all this?" "I wanted the first day back to feel like home." The words settled gently inside Jungkook's heart. They carried no grand declaration, no dramatic confession, only quiet sincerity. That sincerity somehow made them even more powerful. After lunch, they wandered through the rest of the cottage together. Upstairs, Jungkook paused in front of a small bedroom overlooking the valley. Sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating dust particles that floated lazily in the air. Against one wall stood an old easel. Beside it rested neatly arranged paintbrushes and fresh canvases. Jungkook froze. "My studio," Jimin nodded. "I remembered you always wanted one." Jungkook slowly approached the easel. His fingers trembled as he picked up a brush. Years had passed since he had painted seriously. Life, work, responsibility, and grief had quietly buried that part of himself beneath endless obligations. "I almost forgot how much I loved this," he whispered. Jimin leaned against the doorway. "I never forgot." The afternoon drifted peacefully into evening. Together they cleaned forgotten corners of the house, opened windows that had remained shut for years, and laughed over old memories that neither had dared revisit before. As golden sunlight faded behind the mountains, they carried 2 steaming cups of tea onto the front porch. Fireflies gradually appeared across the garden like tiny floating lanterns. The valley grew quiet except for the gentle chorus of crickets. Jungkook wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. When did you decide to buy the house?" Jimin remained silent for several moments before answering. "The night you smiled at someone else." Jungkook looked confused. Jimin chuckled softly. "Not because I was jealous." He gazed toward the distant hills, his eyes reflecting the fading sunset. "You smiled, but it wasn't real. Everyone else believed you were happy. I noticed you kept staring at a photo of this cottage on your phone whenever you thought no one was watching." Jungkook swallowed hard. "You noticed that every single time." Jimin smiled gently. "That's when I realized this wasn't just a house. It was the last place where you still believed your happiest memories existed." Jungkook lowered his eyes toward his untouched tea. He had spent years hiding his loneliness behind effortless smiles, believing nobody could distinguish the genuine ones from the practiced ones. Somehow Jimin always could. I've always been afraid, Jungkook admitted quietly. Afraid that if I finally reached the place I'd been dreaming about, I'd discover it could never make me happy again. Jimin looked at him with quiet understanding. Places don't heal people, he said. People heal people. Sometimes a place simply gives them somewhere safe to begin. Those words lingered between them as the first stars appeared overhead. Jungkook slowly nodded. For the first time in years, the emptiness inside him no longer felt endless. It had not vanished overnight, but it had begun to fill with warmth, memory, and hope. He looked at the softly glowing windows of the cottage and finally realized that the dream he had spent years chasing had never truly been about owning a house. It had always been about finding his way back to the feeling of being loved. And somehow, without asking for anything in return, Jimin had quietly built that path long before Jungkook ever knew he had lost it. Morning arrived wrapped in a blanket of silver mist that drifted lazily across the valley, softening every tree, every rooftop, and every distant hill into the colors of an unfinished painting. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the cottage windows, casting warm golden lines across the wooden floor. Jungkook woke to the gentle sound of birds singing outside his bedroom window, a melody he had not heard since he was a child spending summers with his grandmother. For a few peaceful seconds, he simply lay still, staring at the familiar ceiling beams above him. The memories no longer hurt as sharply as they once had. Instead, they felt like old photographs carefully restored after years of fatting. The smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted upstairs. Jungkook smiled before he even realized he was smiling. He quietly walked downstairs, where Jimin stood in the kitchen wearing an oversized gray sweater with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. His dark hair was still slightly messy from sleep, and a thin layer of flour covered one side of his face. Pancakes sizzled gently in the pan while soft instrumental music played from an old radio sitting on the windowsill. Jungkook leaned against the doorway, folding his arms. "I didn't know you cooked breakfast." Jimin glanced over his shoulder and laughed. "I don't." Jungkook raised an eyebrow. "Then what exactly is happening here?" "I'm conducting an experiment. On food. On whether pancakes are supposed to look like countries that don't exist." Jungkook walked closer and looked into the pan. One pancake vaguely resembled a cloud. Another looked suspiciously like a dinosaur. A third had somehow folded itself into an impossible shape. He burst into laughter. Not the polite laugh he often gave during social gatherings. Not the carefully measured laugh he used around strangers. It was genuine. Bright. Uncontrolled. The sound filled the entire kitchen. Jimin looked at him quietly. His own smile slowly widened. "There it is." Jungkook looked up. "What?" "Your real laugh." Jungkook's laughter gradually faded. "When was the last time you heard it?" Jimin answered almost immediately. "Years ago." Silence settled comfortably between them. Jungkook lowered his eyes. "I didn't even realize I'd stopped." "I know." They finished breakfast together despite the pancakes being uneven and slightly overcooked. Somehow, they tasted better than meals served in expensive restaurants. After cleaning the kitchen, Jimin disappeared upstairs for several minutes before returning with a dusty cardboard box. "I found this in the attic yesterday." Jungkook accepted it carefully. The faded handwriting across the lid immediately caught his attention. "For Jungkook, open when you're ready." His heartbeat quickened. "I've never seen this before." It was hidden beneath old blankets. Jungkook slowly removed the lid. Inside were dozens of carefully preserved memories. Old photographs, childhood drawings, tiny wooden toys, birthday cards, a tiny knitted scarf his grandmother had made when he was 7 years old. At the very bottom rested a worn leather notebook tied together with blue ribbon. His hands trembled. He immediately recognized it. His grandmother's journal. The leather had faded with age, but her elegant handwriting remained unmistakable. He carefully opened the first page. "Some memories deserve to grow old with us." His vision blurred. He turned another page. The journal wasn't merely a diary. It contained recipes, pressed flowers, sketches of the garden, little stories about neighbors, and dozens of observations about Jungkook growing up. Today, Jungkook tried planting tomatoes upside down because he believed they would grow faster. He laughed through tears. "I actually did that." Jimin smiled. I can imagine. Another page. He cried because a bird couldn't fly after hurting its wing. He carried it everywhere inside his jacket until it recovered. Jungkook covered his mouth. I forgot about that. You forgot many beautiful things. Hours slipped by as they sat together in the living room reading page after page. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes neither spoke at all. The journal slowly transformed grief into gratitude. Near the final pages, Jungkook discovered something unexpected. A folded envelope tucked carefully between two sheets. His name was not written on it. Instead it simply read, "To the one who stays beside him." Jungkook looked at Jimin. I think this isn't for me. Jimin shook his head. You should read it. Jungkook unfolded the fragile paper. The handwriting remained steady. If you are reading this, then you are someone my grandson trusted enough to stand beside him after I was gone. Thank you. He is kinder than he believes. He hides sadness behind smiles because he thinks protecting others is more important than asking for help. Please remind him that even the strongest hearts deserve somewhere to rest. Jungkook's breathing became uneven. He continued reading. If he ever returns to this house, don't let him leave carrying only memories of loss. Help him create new ones. The room became impossibly quiet. Jimin stared into the fireplace without speaking. He had never known those words existed. Neither of them had. Jungkook slowly folded the letter. His fingers lingered against the paper. I think. His voice cracked. She somehow knew. Jimin nodded gently. She always understood people. Outside, sunlight spread across the valley as the morning mist disappeared completely. Children rode bicycles along the distant road. A farmer waved while passing the cottage with his old truck. Life continued moving with quiet simplicity. For the first time since arriving, Jungkook stepped outside alone. He wandered slowly through the garden until he reached the ancient apple tree standing near the back fence. The swing hanging beneath its branches still moved gently in the breeze. He sat down. The old ropes creaked softly. Closing his eyes, he remembered countless afternoons swinging there while his grandmother read books beneath the shade. Footsteps approached through the grass. Jimin sat beside him on the neighboring swing. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Jungkook broke the silence. I've spent so much of my life chasing success. Jimin looked toward the mountains. I know. I thought earning more, buying more, achieving more would somehow fill the emptiness. He smiled sadly. But standing here, I realized none of those things were what I was searching for. Jimin gently pushed the swing with one foot. What were you searching for? Jungkook watched sunlight filtering through the leaves. A place where I didn't have to pretend I was okay. Jimin's eyes softened. You've already found it. Jungkook turned toward him. No. A quiet smile spread across his face. I found the person first. Warm afternoon light bathed the entire garden in shades of gold, and for the first time in many years the old cottage no longer felt like a monument to the past. It had become a living home again, filled not only with cherished memories but also with quiet laughter, shared meals, honest conversations, and the comforting certainty that healing was never a journey meant to be walked alone. The following morning unfolded beneath a sky washed clean by the previous night's rain. Sunlight spilled gently across the rolling hills, painting the valley in shades of emerald and gold. Dewdrops clung to every blade of grass, sparkling like tiny crystals as the breeze wandered through the wildflowers surrounding the cottage. Somewhere nearby, the cheerful sound of a wind chime drifted through the air, accompanied by the distant laughter of children walking to school. Jungkook stood on the front porch with a steaming mug of tea between his hands. He watched the peaceful landscape in silence, allowing the warmth of the cup to settle into his fingers. For the first time in years, he felt no urgency to check his phone, answer emails, or rush toward another meeting. Time itself seemed to move differently here. Behind him, the old wooden door creaked open. Jimin stepped outside carrying a small basket. You've been awake for a while. Jungkook nodded. I didn't want to miss the sunrise. Jimin smiled. My grandmother used to say every sunrise is a second chance. Jungkook looked toward the horizon. I think she was right. The two of them began walking along the narrow dirt path leading away from the cottage. The morning air carried the scent of pine trees, fresh soil, and blooming lavender. Birds darted from branch to branch above them, their songs echoing through the quiet valley. After several minutes, they reached a gentle hill overlooking a wide meadow. At its center stood an enormous oak tree. Jungkook stopped walking. "I remember this place. You carved something here." Jungkook looked surprised. "You know about that?" Jimin laughed softly. "I found it." Curious, Jungkook walked toward the massive trunk. His fingertips brushed against the rough bark until they found a faded carving almost hidden beneath decades of growth. It was barely visible now. Two uneven initials. JK. Beside them, written in smaller letters, was a crooked sentence. "One day I'll come home." Jungkook stared silently at the words. "I was 12. I guessed. I thought nobody would ever see this." Jimin smiled gently. "Trees remember." Jungkook rested his forehead against the old oak. "So do hearts." The wind rustled the branches overhead. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Eventually Jimin reached into his jacket pocket. "I have something for you." He handed Jungkook a tiny brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. Jungkook frowned. "I thought I already had the house key. This one opens something else." "What?" "You'll see." They returned to the cottage just before noon. Instead of entering through the front door, Jimin led him toward the small red barn standing behind the garden. The building looked older than the house itself. Its paint had peeled away years ago, leaving weathered wood exposed beneath. Jimin unlocked the heavy doors. They slowly swung open. Dust floated through streams of sunlight pouring inside. At first Jungkook saw nothing unusual. Old gardening tools. Wooden shelves. Empty flower pots. Then his eyes wandered toward the back wall. His breathing stopped. Covered beneath a white cloth stood an upright piano. His piano. The very instrument his grandmother had sold years earlier to pay hospital bills. Jungkook walked toward it in complete disbelief. "No." His voice barely escaped his lips. "This isn't possible." He carefully pulled away the cloth. The polished wood gleamed softly beneath the sunlight. One small scratch remained near the left corner, exactly where he had accidentally dropped a music book when he was 14. His fingers trembled. "It really is." Jimin quietly nodded. "I spent almost 6 months looking for it." Jungkook slowly turned toward him. 6 months. It had been purchased by an elderly music teacher in another province. "You found her?" "Yes." "What happened?" Jimin smiled. "She didn't want to sell it." Jungkook lowered his eyes. "I understand. So I told her why I was looking." "What did she say?" Jimin's smile softened. "She asked one question." "What was it?" "Does the boy still love music?" Jungkook remained silent. "I couldn't answer." The word struck deeply. Because the truth was complicated. He had loved music. Then life became louder than melodies. Responsibilities replaced dreams. Success replaced passion. Grief replaced inspiration. Jimin gently rested one hand on the piano. "So I asked her something instead." "What?" "If someone forgets the language of their heart, can they learn it again?" Jungkook looked at him. "And?" She smiled. Jimin lightly touched one of the piano keys. A single warm note echoed throughout the barn. Then she said yes. Jungkook slowly sat on the old piano bench. His hands hovered above the keys. They hesitated. He had not played in years. His fingers felt unfamiliar. Clumsy. Almost afraid. Jimin quietly stepped back toward the doorway. "You don't have to play perfectly." Jungkook looked at him. "You just have to begin." Taking a slow breath, Jungkook pressed the first key. A soft note filled the room. Then another. Then another. The melody arrived awkwardly at first, broken by long pauses and uncertain movements. Gradually, however, something changed. His fingers began remembering. Not through conscious thought. Through feeling. A forgotten lullaby his grandmother used to hum while baking bread slowly emerged from beneath his fingertips. The simple melody floated through the barn, out across the open fields, and into the quiet afternoon. Jimin closed his eyes. He remembered hearing that same tune years ago while standing outside the cottage window, too shy to come inside. Back then Jungkook had played without fear. Now little by little, that fearless boy seemed to be returning. When the final note faded, silence settled gently around them. Jungkook looked down at his hands. I thought I'd lost this. Jimin shook his head. No. He smiled warmly. You were simply waiting until your heart felt safe enough to play again. Tears quietly gathered in Jungkook's eyes. Not tears of sorrow. Not tears of regret. They were tears of rediscovery. He finally understood that Jimin had never tried to buy him happiness. He had patiently gathered every forgotten piece of Jungkook's past, not to keep him living in old memories, but to remind him of the dreams, talents, and gentle parts of himself that grief had hidden away. As the afternoon sunlight poured through the open barn doors, illuminating floating dust like tiny stars suspended in the air, Jungkook realized the greatest gift was never the cottage itself. It was the chance to become himself again, surrounded by the memories that no longer imprisoned him but quietly showed him the way forward. Autumn arrived quietly, almost unnoticed. The valley awakened beneath a canopy of amber, crimson, and golden leaves that drifted gently through the crisp morning air. The cottage, once silent and forgotten, had become the warmest place in the neighborhood. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney every morning, flower boxes beneath the windows overflowed with late-blooming chrysanthemums, and laughter echoed through the garden more often than the wind itself. Jungkook stood outside with rolled-up sleeves, carefully repairing the old wooden fence that surrounded the property. A small robin landed on one of the fence posts, tilting its head curiously toward him. You came back too. The bird chirped as if answering. Jungkook smiled. He noticed he had begun talking to birds again. It was another childhood habit he had forgotten. Inside the cottage, the familiar sound of piano music drifted through the open windows. Jimin was practicing. Not because he was an expert. Simply because he wanted to accompany Jungkook whenever he played. Sometimes they made mistakes together. Sometimes they laughed more than they played. Neither of them cared. The music was never about perfection. It was about being present. Jungkook finished securing the last wooden plank before wiping the sweat from his forehead. He looked toward the porch. Jimin stepped outside carrying 2 glasses of fresh lemonade. You've been working since sunrise. I wanted to finish before lunch. Jimin handed him one of the glasses. You've changed. Jungkook looked amused. In a good way. In every good way. Jungkook laughed softly. I think this place changed me. Jimin shook his head. No. What do you mean? This place simply reminded you who you already were. The words lingered between them. Jungkook slowly looked around the property. The apple tree. The porch swing. The garden. The old barn. The piano. Every corner had become part of his daily life again. Not as relics of the past. As pieces of the present. That afternoon they decided to clean the attic. Dust danced through narrow beams of sunlight as they sorted through forgotten trunks, faded blankets, and old furniture. Near the back wall stood a large wooden chest covered beneath decades of dust. Its brass lock had long since rusted away. Jungkook carefully lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay dozens of old photo albums. Letters. Christmas ornaments. Handmade quilts. Near the bottom rested a small velvet pouch. Curious, he untied the ribbon. A silver pocket watch slipped gently into his palm. Its surface reflected the afternoon light. Inside the cover was an engraving. For every journey home. Jungkook frowned. I've never seen this. Jimin leaned closer. There must be something else. Beneath the watch rested another folded letter. This one was addressed directly to Jungkook. He unfolded it slowly. My dear boy. If you have found this, then life has finally brought you home. There was something I never told you. Jungkook's heartbeat quickened. Years ago, when your parents passed away, many people offered to buy this house. They believed I couldn't take care of it alone. I refused every offer because I knew this house wasn't simply made of wood and stone. It was built from every laugh, every birthday, every bedtime story, every tear we shared. His vision blurred. He continued reading. One day I knew I would have to let it go. Not because I wanted to. Because I wanted you to have a future without worrying about me. Jungkook closed his eyes. He remembered the difficult months before her illness became severe. The medical bills. The quiet conversations she thought he couldn't hear. The sacrifices she never mentioned. He had spent years believing she had reluctantly sold the house because life had forced her to. Now he realized something deeper. She had willingly sacrificed her own happiness to protect his. A tear rolled silently down his cheek. Jimin placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. Some truths deserved silence before words. After several moments, Jungkook folded the letter carefully. I spent years feeling guilty. Jimin looked at him. I thought if I had earned money sooner, maybe she wouldn't have sold the house. Jimin's expression softened. She never wanted you carrying that burden. I know. Jungkook smiled sadly. But children often blame themselves for things they could never control. Jimin nodded slowly. So do adults. They carried the box downstairs. As evening settled across the valley, the cottage filled with the comforting aroma of homemade stew simmering gently on the stove. Rain began falling outside once again. Soft, steady, peaceful. The kind of rain that invited people to stay indoors. They sat together beside the fireplace after dinner. Flames danced quietly across the stone hearth. Jungkook held the pocket watch in both hands. I've been thinking. Jimin looked up from his book. About what? This house shouldn't only belong to me. Jimin frowned. What do you mean? When I was a child. Jungkook smiled at the memories. My grandmother never let anyone leave hungry. He looked toward the kitchen. Travelers stopped here. Neighbors came for tea. Children learned to bake cookies. People who felt lonely always knew this door was open. Jimin listened quietly. I want that again. You want to invite everyone. I want this house to become what it always was. Jimin smiled. A home. Jungkook nodded. Not only for us. For anyone who needs one. The following weekend, handwritten invitations appeared throughout the small village. They simply read, the cottage is open. Come for tea. Bring your stories. Leave with hope. No grand event. No celebration. Just an open door. On Saturday afternoon, the first guests arrived. An elderly couple carrying homemade bread. A widowed teacher with freshly picked apples. Children chasing one another across the garden. A young musician who had recently moved into the valley. Soon the living room filled with quiet conversations, laughter, and the comforting sounds of ordinary life. The piano played softly in the background. Fresh pastries disappeared almost as quickly as Jimin placed them on the table. Jungkook stood in the doorway for a moment, watching everyone. The cottage looked different now. Not because anything had changed physically. Because it was full again. Exactly as his grandmother had always wanted. Jimin walked beside him. You know. What? I think should be happy. Jungkook looked around the room. An elderly woman was teaching children how to knit. Neighbors laughed over old memories. Someone had begun singing while another quietly accompanied them on the piano. Warm light from the fireplace reflected across smiling faces. He felt something settle peacefully inside his heart. Not grief. Not longing. Belonging. He smiled gently. I think. He looked toward the photograph of his grandmother resting on the mantel above the fireplace. She never really left. The cottage no longer stood as a symbol of what had been lost. It had become a place where kindness multiplied, where strangers became friends, where old wounds softened through shared laughter, and where every person who stepped through the front door discovered that the greatest homes are not remembered for their walls, but for the love that continues to live within them. Winter arrived with quiet grace, wrapping the valley in a blanket of fresh snow that sparkled beneath the pale morning sun. Every rooftop, every branch, and every winding path surrounding the cottage wore a coat of white so perfect that the entire landscape looked like a watercolor painting brought gently to life. Thin curls of smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the comforting scent of burning cedar into the crisp air. Inside, the cottage glowed with warmth. The fireplace crackled softly. Fresh cinnamon rolls cooled on the kitchen table. The piano filled the living room with a gentle melody while snowflakes drifted peacefully beyond the windows. Jungkook sat beside the fire, reading through another page of his grandmother's journal. Although he had already read every word several times, each page somehow revealed something new. Some memories changed every time the heart became ready to understand them. Jimin entered the room carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. I thought you might need this. Jungkook accepted the mug with a grateful smile. Thank you. Jimin noticed the journal resting on his lap. Still reading. I don't think I'll ever finish. Jimin smiled. Good memories are like that. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire dance across the old stone fireplace. Outside, children laughed while building snowmen in the garden. Neighbors waved as they walked past the cottage carrying baskets of fresh bread and homemade soup. Since opening the house to the community, visitors had become part of everyday life. Some came for conversation. Some came for warmth. Others simply came because they knew someone would always welcome them with a smile. The cottage had quietly become the heart of the valley. Late that afternoon, a familiar knock echoed through the hallway. Jungkook opened the door. Standing outside was an elderly woman wearing a dark green wool coat. Silver hair framed her kind face. Her gentle smile carried a quiet familiarity. Excuse me, she said politely. My name is Mrs. Evelyn. Jungkook welcomed her inside. It's nice to meet you. The woman stepped into the warm living room and slowly looked around. Her eyes lingered on the piano. Then the fireplace. Then the family photographs displayed across the shelves. Finally, they settled on the portrait of Jungkook's grandmother. Tears immediately filled her eyes. I knew her. Jungkook looked surprised. You did? Mrs. Evelyn nodded. We were childhood friends. The room grew quiet. Jimin quietly placed another cup of tea on the table before allowing the two of them to sit together. I moved overseas many years ago, Mrs. Evelyn explained. I only returned to the valley a few weeks ago. She smiled sadly. I came hopping to visit her. Jungkook gently lowered his eyes. I'm sorry. Mrs. Evelyn reached across the table and softly squeezed his hand. Don't be. She lived exactly the way she wanted. The elderly woman slowly opened her handbag. I've been carrying something for almost 20 years. From inside, she carefully removed a beautifully wrapped package tied with pale blue ribbon. I promised her I would only give this to you. Jungkook stared at the gift. To me, she said. Mrs. Evelyn smiled through tears. Give it to him after he finds his way home. Silence filled the room. Jungkook carefully untied the ribbon. Inside rested a beautifully carved wooden music box. Its craftsmanship was extraordinary. Small flowers had been hand-carved along its edges. He slowly lifted the lid. A familiar lullaby began playing. The very same melody he had recently rediscovered on the old piano. His eyes immediately filled with tears. Beneath the tiny musical mechanism rested another folded letter. He unfolded it carefully. My precious Jungkook. If this music is playing, then I know your heart has begun smiling again. I always believed you would return. Not because houses call people back. Love does. Jungkook smiled through quiet tears. The handwriting felt like hearing her voice again. Never be afraid of building new memories. They never replace the old ones. They simply sit beside them. He looked up at Jimin. Their eyes met. Both understood those words without needing to speak. Mrs. Evelyn quietly continued. She talked about you constantly. Jungkook laughed softly. I hope she didn't embarrass me too much. The elderly woman laughed. Oh, she certainly did. They all smiled. She always said one thing. What was it? My grandson believes he's ordinary. Mrs. Evelyn looked directly at him. One day someone will love him enough to prove he isn't. Jungkook's smile slowly disappeared. His gaze instinctively turned toward Jimin. Jimin looked away, pretending to become fascinated by the firewood stacked beside the fireplace. A faint blush appeared across his cheeks. Mrs. Evelyn noticed. She smiled knowingly but said nothing. As evening settled outside, the neighbors gradually gathered at the cottage once again. Someone decorated the Christmas tree standing near the front window. Children carefully hung handmade ornaments. An elderly man tuned an old violin. Fresh cookies filled the kitchen with the sweet aroma of vanilla and butter. Snow continued falling outside while warm golden light spilled from every window. Jungkook stood quietly near the staircase, watching everyone laugh together. Not long ago this house had echoed only with silence. Now every room overflowed with life. Jimin approached him carrying two small ornaments. I found these in the attic. They were tiny wooden stars. One had the initials JK carefully painted by hand. The other simply read, Asterisk home. Jungkook held them gently. My grandmother made these. I thought they belonged on the tree. Together they walked toward the Christmas tree. Jungkook hung the ornament marked JK asterisk on one branch. Jimin carefully placed the ornament reading asterisk asterisk home asterisk beside it. They stepped back. The two ornaments hung together beneath the warm glow of tiny lights. Simple. Beautiful. Complete. The evening slowly transformed into music. Neighbors sang old winter songs while children danced around the living room. The fire crackled. Snowflakes drifted peacefully beyond the windows. The cottage breathed with happiness. Jungkook quietly walked onto the porch for a moment. Snow landed softly upon his shoulders. The valley stretched peacefully beneath the moonlight. Jimin joined him a few moments later. Neither of them spoke immediately. Finally, Jungkook broke the silence. Do you know what I've realized? What? I spent years believing this house was my dream. Jimin looked at him. It wasn't. Jungkook smiled gently. It was only the road. The road to what? He turned toward the warmly lit windows where laughter echoed from inside. Then he looked back at Jimin. The road that led me to the life I was always meant to have. Jimin's eyes softened. Neither of them needed another explanation. Behind them, the cottage glowed against the snowy landscape like a lantern guiding weary hearts home. And for the first time in many years, Jungkook no longer wondered whether he belonged there. He simply knew that he did. Spring arrived almost overnight. The snow slowly disappeared from the hills, giving way to fields covered with fresh green grass and thousands of wildflowers dancing beneath the gentle breeze. Cherry blossoms painted the valley in soft shades of pink, while the old apple tree beside the cottage awakened once again, its branches bursting with tiny white blossoms that filled the air with a delicate fragrance. The cottage had never looked more alive. Flower boxes overflowed with colorful blooms. Fresh herbs grew beside the kitchen window. The porch swing swayed gently in the morning breeze. Laughter drifted from inside almost every day. Jungkook stood in the garden watering the roses his grandmother had planted decades earlier. Tiny droplets sparkled in the sunlight before disappearing into the rich soil. He smiled as he noticed fresh buds beginning to bloom. They're finally coming back. Behind him, Jimin walked across the garden carrying a basket filled with vegetables picked from the small greenhouse they had recently restored. They've been waiting. Jungkook looked at him. So have we. The words made them both smile. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Every morning they shared breakfast. Every afternoon neighbors stopped by for tea. Every evening music drifted from the old piano into the quiet valley. Without realizing it, the cottage had become something far greater than either of them had imagined. People no longer called it simply the old house. They called it the house with the open door. Travelers passing through the valley often stopped after hearing stories about the welcoming cottage where nobody was ever treated like a stranger. One warm Saturday morning, several children arrived carrying sketchbooks and boxes of colored pencils. A shy little girl stepped onto the porch. Mr. Jungkook. Jungkook smiled warmly. Yes. My teacher said you used to paint. He laughed softly. I did. Will you teach us? He hesitated. It had been years since he had considered himself an artist. Even after rediscovering painting, he still doubted whether he deserved that title. Jimin quietly placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. They're not asking for perfection. Jungkook looked at the eager faces waiting hopefully in the garden. They're asking for you. A gentle smile spread across his face. He nodded. I'd love to. Soon the garden transformed into an outdoor art class. Canvases rested beneath the shade of the old apple tree. Paintbrushes moved excitedly through bright colors. Children laughed whenever paint accidentally landed on their noses instead of their artwork. Jungkook wandered from one easel to another, encouraging every small brushstroke. There are no mistakes. One little boy frowned at his painting. But my tree doesn't look real. Jungkook knelt beside him. Does it look like your imagination? The boy nodded. Then it's perfect. Jimin watched from the porch. He had not seen Jungkook this alive in years. Every smile was effortless. Every laugh came naturally. Every encouraging word sounded sincere. The quiet sadness that had once lived behind his eyes had slowly disappeared. That evening, after the children had gone home carrying their colorful paintings, Jungkook found a folded piece of paper left behind on one of the easels. It was a drawing. The cottage stood beneath a bright blue sky. Flowers surrounded the garden. Two figures stood on the porch smiling. Above the drawing, written in careful handwriting, were simple words. "Thank you for making this place feel like home." Jungkook silently looked at the picture. His chest tightened. It isn't signed. Jimin glanced at the drawing. It doesn't have to be. Jungkook carefully placed it inside the journal where he kept his grandmother's letters. It belongs there. As sunset painted the valley in warm shades of orange and gold, the two of them walked toward the hill overlooking the cottage. The same hill where they had once stood beneath storm clouds. Everything looked different now. The roof reflected the evening light. Smoke rose gently from the chimney. Children chased butterflies across the nearby field. Neighbors waved from passing bicycles. The entire valley seemed brighter. Jungkook sat beneath the old oak tree. For several moments, he simply admired the view. "I've been thinking about something." Jimin sat beside him. "What is it?" "My grandmother always believed homes should continue growing." Jimin nodded. "She did. I want to build something." Jimin looked curious. "What?" "A small studio beside the garden. For painting. For music." Jungkook smiled. "For writing. For anyone who needs a quiet place to dream." Jimin's eyes softened. "She would love that." Jungkook laughed gently. "I hope so." The following weeks became filled with joyful work. Neighbors volunteered without being asked. The village carpenter donated reclaimed wood. Children painted colorful signs. An elderly mason carefully laid the stone foundation. Someone planted lavender around the entrance. Another neighbor handcrafted wooden benches. No one accepted payment. Whenever Jungkook tried to thank them, they all answered the same way. "You gave this valley a home again." 1 month later, the little studio stood completed. Its large windows overlooked the blooming garden. Morning sunlight filled every corner. Shelves held books donated by neighbors. Fresh canvases leaned against one wall. The restored piano stood proudly near the window. A small handwritten sign above the entrance simply read, "Dream Room." No names. No ownership. Just an invitation. On opening day, the room remained full from sunrise until evening. A young musician composed his first melody. An elderly woman finished the poem she had started 30 years earlier. Children painted colorful landscapes. Someone quietly read a novel beside the window. Jungkook stood near the doorway watching everyone. He remembered the lonely boy who had once carved hopeful words into the old oak tree. "One day I'll come home." He smiled. He finally understood something that had taken years to learn. Home was never waiting for him. Home had been growing quietly through every act of kindness, every shared meal, every honest conversation, every melody played on the old piano, and every person who chose to walk through the open door. As twilight settled gently across the valley, the cottage and the little studio glowed side by side beneath the evening sky, not as symbols of wealth or success, but as quiet reminders that the greatest dreams are the ones that continue bringing hope to others long after they come true. Summer returned to the valley exactly 1 year after Jungkook had first stood outside the cottage in the rain, believing he had arrived too late to reclaim the place that had once held every beautiful memory of his childhood. Now the house no longer waited in silence. Its windows stood open to welcome the warm breeze. Wild roses climbed along the white wooden fence. The garden overflowed with color. Children's laughter echoed beneath the old apple tree every afternoon, while music drifted gently from the dream room until the stars appeared each evening. The cottage had become a place where strangers found friends, lonely hearts found comfort, and forgotten dreams quietly found their way back home. One peaceful morning, Jungkook walked alone through every room of the house. He paused in the kitchen where his grandmother had once baked bread before sunrise. He smiled at the dining table where countless conversations had healed invisible wounds. He rested his hand against the piano that had once seemed impossible to find again. Finally, he climbed the stairs to the small bedroom overlooking the valley. Sunlight poured through the window exactly as it had when he was a little boy. On the desk rested his grandmother's journal. Beside it lay every letter she had left behind. Jungkook slowly opened the journal one final time. Tucked inside the last page was a tiny dried lavender flower that he had somehow overlooked. A single sentence had been written beneath it. Love never asks where home is. Love quietly becomes home. Jungkook closed his eyes. A peaceful smile appeared on his face. For so many years he had believed he was searching for a house. Then he believed he was searching for the memories he had lost. Now he understood that he had actually been searching for the courage to let himself be loved again. He carefully placed the journal back on the shelf. Not because he wanted to forget the past, but because he no longer needed to keep searching through it. Everything it had been trying to teach him was finally living inside his heart. When he stepped outside, he found Jimin sitting beneath the old oak tree, quietly watching the afternoon sunlight dance across the valley. "You disappeared. I was saying thank you. To your grandmother's." Jungkook nodded. "And to this house." Jimin smiled. "I think it heard you." The two of them slowly walked toward the hill overlooking the cottage. The same hill where storms had once filled the sky. Today the horizon stretched endlessly beneath brilliant blue light. Butterflies floated across fields of wildflowers. The wind carried the sweet fragrance of lavender and freshly cut grass. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary. Jungkook stopped walking. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "When you bought this house," Jimin looked at him quietly, "were you ever afraid I'd refuse it?" Jimin laughed softly. "Every single day." "Then why didn't you give up?" Jimin gazed toward the cottage. "Because love isn't measured by whether someone accepts what you give." He smiled gently. "It's measured by whether their happiness matters more than your fear." Jungkook felt tears quietly gather in his eyes once again. Not tears of sadness. Not even tears of gratitude. They were tears born from finally understanding something simple and profound. For years he had believed that the greatest gift Jimin had given him was the dream house. It wasn't. The greatest gift had been patience. Patience that expected nothing in return. Patience that quietly protected another person's dream. Patience that waited until a wounded heart was ready to believe in happiness again. Jungkook stepped closer. This time there were no hesitant words. No uncertainty. No fear hiding behind polite smiles. He gently took Jimin's hand. "Thank you." Jimin smiled. "You've thanked me enough." Jungkook shook his head. "No." His voice became softer. "Not for the house." Jimin looked at him. "For reminding me that I never had to earn love." The afternoon breeze carried the silence between them like the final page of a beautiful story. Neither of them felt the need to say anything more. Some endings did not require dramatic promises. Some endings simply arrived when two hearts finally found peace. Years passed. The cottage continued welcoming anyone who knocked on its door. The dream room became a place where young artists discovered their confidence, musicians composed songs that filled the valley with hope, and writers found the courage to tell stories that had lived quietly inside them for years. Visitors often asked why the cottage felt so different from every other place they had ever visited. Jungkook always answered with the same warm smile. "Because this house was built twice." The visitors usually looked confused. He would simply glance toward Jimin before continuing. "The first time with wood and stone. And the second time." His smile became brighter. "With kindness." Every spring, fresh lavender bloomed beneath the windows. Every summer, music floated through the garden. Every autumn, golden leaves covered the old pathway. Every winter, warm lights welcomed weary travelers through the falling snow. The seasons continued changing. The house quietly remained, not as a monument to the past, not as a symbol of sacrifice, but as living proof that the most beautiful homes are never purchased with money alone. They are built through compassion, protected by loyalty, filled with laughter, strengthened by forgiveness, and illuminated by people who choose every single day to love without expecting anything in return. And somewhere, perhaps carried by the gentle wind moving through the apple blossoms or hidden within the quiet melody of the old piano, it almost felt as though Jungkook's grandmother was still smiling. Not because her house had been saved, but because the love she had planted within its walls had continued to grow long after she was gone. The cottage remained exactly what she had always hoped it would become. A place where every goodbye turned into a new beginning. A place where every lonely heart found warmth. A place where dreams, no matter how long they had been forgotten, always found their way home.